The vote is already 7-1 when Leo Ferrante stands up and puts his gun on the table. Not a threat. Not a bluff. A statement. 11 years of building this family from the ground up. 7 men who owe him everything sitting around that table. And Leo looks at every single one of them and says the words that will change everything. You remove her, you remove me. Nobody speaks. The room smells of cigar smoke and tension thick enough to cut. At the far end of the table, his uncle, the man who taught Leo how to survive before he taught him how to lead, shakes his head like a man watching something irreplaceable shatter in slow motion. She's nobody, Leo. A girl from Ohio with soft hands and no name in this world. You cannot burn this family to the ground for a woman nobody chose. I chose her, Leo says. That's enough. He picks up the gun. He walks out. And somewhere on the second floor of that same building, Clara Wells is sitting on the edge of a bed that isn't hers yet, holding a ring she didn't ask for, having no idea that the man who placed it on her finger just chose her over everything he's ever built. She's about to find out exactly what that costs both of them. 6 weeks earlier, Clara had been doing what she always did on a Saturday, running deliveries for her aunt's flower shop in Columbus, Ohio, arguing with GPS directions, and trying not to spill a 400 orchid arrangement in the back of a van with a broken air conditioner. The delivery address was a private estate outside the city, the kind of place that doesn't show up on standard mapping apps and requires a gate code 3 digits longer than any she'd used before. The event was a formal engagement dinner. Not hers. Someone else's celebration, requiring 12 centerpieces and a timeline that left her exactly 20 minutes to unload, arrange, and disappear back down the driveway. She was halfway through arrangement number 7 when the argument started in the next room. Not loud, the kind of argument that's somehow worse for being quiet, voices controlled and deliberate, punctuated by the occasional sound of something heavy hitting a table. Clara kept her head down, moved faster, reminded herself that whatever was happening behind those closed doors was none of her business. Then the door opened, and the argument walked directly into the room where she was working. 2 men, expensive suits, the kind of stillness that comes from years of learning not to telegraph emotions in dangerous company. They stopped when they saw her. She stopped when she saw them. The taller one, dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes the color of slate after rain, looked at her for exactly 3 seconds before something shifted in his expression. Who are you? He asked, not unkindly. The florist, Clara said. I'm almost done. I'll be out of your way. Don't rush, the man said, and there was something in his voice that made the second man, his companion, glance over sharply, reading a significance Clara couldn't see yet. She finished the last arrangement, packed her supplies, and drove back down the driveway without looking back. She didn't get his name. She didn't think about him again until his driver showed up at her aunt's flower shop 4 days later with a card asking if she'd be interested in handling arrangements for a private estate on a regular basis. The rate offered was 3 times what the shop made in an average week. Clara said yes before she finished reading the number. Clara believed she was simply picking up a lucrative contract for floral arrangements at a wealthy client's home. She had no idea that Leo Ferrante had spent 4 days trying to convince himself he didn't need to see her again, and had failed entirely by Tuesday morning. The estate was everything the flower shop wasn't: vast, immaculate, and so quiet you could hear your own footsteps thinking. Clara came twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, and learned quickly that the household staff operated with a precision that suggested military training rather than hospitality experience. Men who moved through corridors with their hands always slightly too close to their jacket pockets. Doors that opened and closed in sequences she eventually recognized as security rotations. She kept her eyes forward, her hands busy, her questions to herself. She was good at that. She'd spent most of her life learning how to be useful without making herself conspicuous, how to fill a room with beauty without taking up too much of it herself. Leo found her on the 3rd Tuesday, standing in the east garden with dirt on her knees, replanting a rose she'd noticed drooping near the gate. That's not in your contract, he said, from a few feet behind her. Clara didn't startle. She'd heard him coming. No, she agreed, pressing soil around the base of the stem. But it was dying. It seemed like a waste to walk past it. Leo crouched beside her, examining the plant with the attention of someone who doesn't know the first thing about roses but intends to understand them before he stands back up. Will it survive? Clara said. It just needed someone to notice it was struggling. Leo glanced sideways at her, something unguarded crossing his usually composed expression. That's a useful skill to have. I notice things, Clara said simply. It's the job. What have you noticed about this one? He gestured at the estate around them, and she understood he wasn't asking about the grounds. Clara sat back on her heels, dusting off her gloves, considering how honest to be. That it's beautiful and very, very controlled, she said finally. That everyone who works here is careful in a way that goes beyond professional. That you walk through your own house like you're waiting for something to go wrong. Leo was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Most people see what they're supposed to see here, he said. I'm not most people, Clara said, and stood up, collecting her tools. The roses will need watering Friday. I'll see myself out. She made it 3 steps before he spoke again. Have dinner with me. Clara stopped, not turning around. That's also not in the contract. No, Leo agreed. It isn't. Have dinner with me anyway. She turned then, studying him, the careful composure, the slate-gray eyes, the particular loneliness of a man who'd built something extraordinary and had nobody to eat dinner with at the end of the day. She recognized the particular loneliness. She'd been carrying her own version of it for years. Wednesday, she said. I have a delivery before noon. After that, I'm free. Leo smiled, slow and genuine, the kind of smile that looked like it didn't come out often enough. The dinner was at the estate rather than a restaurant, which she suspected was less about preference and more about security, though he didn't say so and she didn't ask. The table was set for 2 in a small room off the main dining hall. Nothing formal, candles and simple food, and the particular ease of a space that didn't require either of them to perform for an audience. She arrived with flowers still on her sleeve from the morning's work, an oversight she noticed halfway through the drive and decided not to turn back for. Leo noticed it the moment she walked in and said nothing, which she filed away as a small, significant thing. Tell me something about you that has nothing to do with flowers, Leo said, pouring her a glass of wine. Clara thought about it honestly. I read the last chapter of books first, she admitted. Always, people think it ruins the story. I think knowing the ending lets you actually pay attention to everything in between. Leo set down the bottle, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the specific focus of a man who hears more in a sentence than the speaker intended. You're not afraid of where things end up, he said. You just want to understand the journey properly. Something like that, Clara said. What about you? Something that has nothing to do with this house. Leo was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding how honest to be. I collect maps, he finally said. Old ones. Cities that don't exist anymore. Borders that have moved. Names that changed. I find them in estate sales mostly. My head of security thinks it's the strangest hobby a man in my position could have. Why maps? Because they're honest about the fact that nothing stays exactly as it was, Leo said. Every map is already a little bit wrong the moment it's printed. I find that comforting rather than troubling. Clara studied him across the table, something warm and careful settling in her chest. That, she said, is the most unexpectedly lovely thing I've heard in a very long time. Leo's expression shifted into something genuinely startled, as though he'd forgotten how to receive a simple, direct compliment without bracing for the catch hidden underneath it. Clara believed the dinner was simply the beginning of something pleasant and uncomplicated. A wealthy client, an unlikely friendship, an arrangement that suited them both. She had no idea that Leo Ferrante had not invited a woman to dinner in 4 years, and that his uncle had already heard about the florist from Ohio before Wednesday arrived. They had dinner on Wednesday and then again the following Wednesday and the one after that. Neither of them named what it was becoming. They talked about everything else instead. Her mother's garden in Columbus. The way she'd inherited a love of growing things from a woman who'd believed that coaxing life out of reluctant soil was the closest thing to magic that didn't require any special gifts. His father's early years building legitimate business before the empire beneath it had grown too large to keep separate. The particular weight of inheriting something you didn't entirely choose. Do you ever want to walk away from it? Clara asked one evening, for weeks in, sitting across from him at a dinner table that felt less formal every time. Some days, Leo said honestly, but I'm responsible for people now. The ones who work for me, the families who depend on the organization staying stable. Walking away would be a luxury I'd be buying with other people's security. Clara studied him quietly. That's a very lonely way to think about your own life. It's the accurate way, Leo said. Most people in my position tell themselves a different story. I prefer the honest one. The honest story, Clara said slowly, is that you've been so busy being responsible for everyone else that you've stopped being responsible for yourself. The words landed somewhere that clearly hadn't been touched in a long time. Leo looked at her with an expression that was half recognition, half something more cautious. You say things like that, he said, and then you act like they're just observations. Aren't they? Not when they're right, Leo said quietly. She drove home that evening, turning the conversation over in her mind, arriving at her apartment above the flower shop to find her cat entirely unimpressed by her lateness and her aunt's voicemail asking whether she'd remembered to lock the refrigerator unit. The ordinary small machinery of her ordinary life, unchanged and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had shifted in a garden in front of a man who collected old maps and smiled like he'd forgotten how. She stood at her kitchen window for a while, looking out at nothing in particular, and told herself firmly that whatever this was, she was going to keep her head about it. She did not, in fact, keep her head about it. The following Tuesday, she brought a small cutting from a particularly stubborn hydrangea she'd been propagating in her own kitchen. No reason given, no occasion required, simply leaving it on the potting bench in the east garden before she started her arrangements. She was almost out the door when she heard his voice behind her. This isn't mine, Leo said. It will be, Clara said, without turning around. Give it about 6 weeks and some patience. 3 days later, Leo called the flower shop for the first time, ostensibly to adjust the Friday order. She could hear him finding reasons to extend the conversation past the point of business, and she let him, leaning against the work table with her arms crossed and a smile she was glad he couldn't see. You're stalling, she said finally. A pause. I was going to ask if you'd eaten dinner. It's 3 in the afternoon, Leo. An early dinner. That's called lunch. Then lunch, he said, and the ease in his voice, slightly self-deprecating, genuinely warm, made her chest do something inconvenient. 3 days later, his uncle Vincent arrived at the estate. Vincent Ferrante was 72 years old and had survived 4 attempts on his life by being the most politically astute man in any room he entered. He had watched Leo build the organization from a troubled adolescent inheriting chaos into a composed, formidable force, and he had opinions about everything in Leo's life, including the florist whose van appeared in the estate driveway twice a week. She's nobody, Vincent said flatly in Leo's study. No family in this world. No name that means anything. You bring this woman into our circle and you hand every rival family a target with no protection, no understanding of how this works, and no way to defend herself. She understands more than you think, Leo said. She fixes flowers, Leo. She's soft. Kind, I'm sure, but soft. The women in this life are hard because they have to be. You'd be putting her in danger every day simply by keeping her near you. Everyone near me is in danger every day, Leo said. That's never stopped me from having a security team. A security team can be replaced, Vincent said sharply. The damage you do to this organization's credibility, to our relationships with the other families, by choosing a civilian with no standing, that can't be undone. Marry within the world, Leo. Find someone suitable. I'll take it under consideration, Leo said, which meant Vincent understood that he wouldn't. The formal vote was called 2 weeks later. Clara knew none of this. She arrived at the estate on a Tuesday with 12 white orchids for the front reception and walked into a building where 7 men were currently deciding whether her presence in Leo Ferrante's life was a liability they could afford to tolerate. Clara found out about the vote not from Leo, but from Marco, his head of security, who appeared at her van window as she was loading out that Tuesday afternoon with an expression somewhere between guilt and warning. He didn't want you to know, Marco said, without preamble. But you should. She sat in the driver's seat of her van outside the Ferrante estate and listened to everything, the 7-to-1 vote, the family pressure, the formal verdict that Leo's attachment to a civilian woman with no standing in their world was a strategic liability. Those steps would be taken if he refused to reconsider. She drove back to the flower shop, and she sat behind the work table for 2 hours rearranging stems that didn't need rearranging, thinking about a rose that had been quietly dying near a gate until someone noticed it struggling. She thought about her mother's garden, and the things her mother used to say about coaxing life from reluctant soil, that the plants that fought hardest to survive were always the ones worth saving. She thought about maps that were already slightly wrong the moment they were printed, and a man who found that comforting rather than troubling. She thought about the particular expression on Leo's face when she'd read the last chapter of a conversation he hadn't finished writing yet. Then she got back in the van and drove to the estate. Clara had never walked into a room she wasn't invited into in her life. She'd spent most of her life doing the opposite, shrinking herself into corners, taking up less space than she was given, apologizing for the particular fullness of her presence in rooms that seemed designed for narrower people. She'd learned it early and carried it quietly and told herself it was simply good manners. She walked through the estate's front door without knocking anyway. Marco, stationed near the entrance, looked at her with an expression she recognized as surprise held very carefully in check. "He's in the study," Marco said after a moment's pause. "I'll let him know you're here." "That's all right," Clara said. "I know where it is." Leo was exactly where she'd known she'd find him, standing at the window with his back to the door, the posture of a man looking at something he's already decided about. He turned when he heard her, and whatever he'd been bracing to feel when he told her shifted into something unguarded the moment he registered that she was already here, that she'd come on her own, that she'd chosen to walk through that door before he'd had a chance to decide how to word the explanation. "You know," he said, "Marco told me. I was going to tell you myself. When?" Leo stood, crossing the room toward her. "After I'd handled it. I didn't want you carrying the weight of a decision that was never yours to make." "It was entirely mine to make," Clara said firmly. "You don't get to decide what I'm strong enough to know, Leo. Nobody does." He stopped a foot away from her, something shifting in his expression, recognition, and then a very specific kind of respect. "You're right," he said simply. "I'm sorry." "Tell me what happened," Clara said. "All of it." He told her about the vote, about Vincent, about the formal family verdict, about the gun he'd set on that table that morning and the words he'd said and the room that had gone silent when he'd walked out. Clara listened without interrupting, her hands quiet in her lap, her expression steady in the way she'd learned to be steady in rooms that were trying to be bigger than her. "What happens now?" she asked when he finished. "Now," Leo said, "I find out who this family actually is when they're asked to choose between power and principle." Leo believed the vote and his response to it were the end of the immediate danger. He had no idea that Vincent, watching his nephew walk away from the family's decision for the first time in 11 years, had already made a call, not to challenge Leo directly, but to remove the problem at its source. The call came at 11 p.m. Marco's voice, controlled and urgent in the particular way that meant something had gone wrong faster than anyone had prepared for. 2 men had been spotted near Clara's flower shop. Not approaching, not moving, just watching. The particular patience of professionals waiting for a window. Leo was moving before Marco finished the sentence, his security team mobilizing with the silent efficiency of people who had drilled exactly this scenario. Clara's phone went to voicemail. He tried 3 times in the car, each unanswered ring tightening something in his chest he had no name for yet. She was still in the shop. He knew it before he saw the light on in the back room. She worked late on Tuesdays, reorganizing the walk-in refrigerator, a routine she'd mentioned once over dinner in the way people mention the small ordinary rhythms of their lives without knowing someone is quietly memorizing them. The 2 men outside hadn't moved yet. They were waiting for the street to empty. They didn't get the chance. Leo's team surrounded the block in under 4 minutes. Not the first time Marco had managed exactly this kind of containment, and the efficiency of it was both remarkable and quietly chilling. The 2 men, recognizing the mathematics of their position, stood down without a fight, which told Leo everything he needed to know about who they were and what they'd been sent to do. He went into the shop himself. Clara was exactly where he'd known she'd be, standing at the work table in the back, surrounded by white lilies and the particular focused quiet of someone deep in the rhythm of their work. She looked up when the door opened, reading his expression instantly. "How bad?" she asked. "It's handled," Leo said. "Are you all right?" I didn't know anything was happening. I know. He crossed the shop, stopping across the work table from her, the flowers between them. I'm sorry. I told you I'd handle it before it reached you, and I nearly didn't. Clara looked at him steadily. What happens to the men outside? They'll answer questions. Then they'll spend a very long time understanding the consequences of going after someone under my protection. And Vincent? Leo was quiet for a moment. Vincent made a choice tonight, he said. So did I. The family he built is going to have to decide which of those choices they can live with. Clara came around the work table, closing the distance between them, and reached up to press her palm flat against his chest, feeling the heartbeat still hammering beneath the controlled exterior. I'm not asking you to choose between me and them, she said quietly. I want you to understand that. I never asked for that. I know, Leo said, covering her hand with his. I chose anyway. That's the difference. The meeting with Vincent happened 3 days later, not in a boardroom with guns on the table, but in the garden of the estate where a rose had been quietly dying near the gate until someone noticed it struggling. Leo brought Clara. Vincent brought nothing except the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent his whole life winning and is beginning to understand the things he's lost in the process. Vincent looked older in the garden than he did in boardrooms. Clara noticed it the moment he walked through the gate. The way sunlight is less forgiving than fluorescent light. The way a man in his 70s looks different without the architecture of authority holding him upright. He looked at her directly when Leo introduced them, with the frank, unsentimental assessment of someone who has spent decades reading people for survival. Clara looked back without flinching. She'd spent enough years in rooms that wanted her smaller to recognize the test and be entirely unbothered by it. They sat for a long time, the three of them, and the conversation that happened was not the one Vincent had been preparing for, not a power struggle, not an ultimatum, not a negotiation. It was something quieter and harder than any of those. Leo telling his uncle the truth about what the last 4 years of his leadership had actually cost him. Vincent, eventually, listens in the way that people who have loved someone a long time will finally listen when the person they love stops performing steadiness and simply speaks. Clara said very little. She didn't need to. Some conversations only need the right witness to finally happen honestly. When Vincent finally stood to leave, he paused at the garden gate near the rose Clara had replanted weeks earlier, now budding, stubbornly green against the late autumn cold. He looked at it for a long moment. Your father would have liked her, he said finally to Leo, though he glanced once at Clara. He was always better at recognizing what was worth protecting than I gave him credit for. He left without another word, and neither of them watched him go. They sat together in the quiet of the garden until the light went golden and then dim, and the city beyond the gates carried on, entirely unaware of what had just shifted inside them. Do you think it's over? Clara asked eventually. The worst of it, Leo said. The rest takes time. I'm good at taking time with things that are worth it, Clara said. Leo reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, the garden around them settling into evening. They sat there a while longer in the particular silence that only exists between two people who have just survived something together and are only now beginning to understand what they built in the process. Clara watched a late bird cut low across the garden and disappear beyond the wall. Leo watched her watch it. I owe you something, he said eventually. You don't owe me anything, Leo. An apology, he said. A real one. Not for the vote or for Vincent or for the men outside your shop. For the way I handled the beginning of this. Trying to manage the risk of you from a distance instead of simply being honest about what this was becoming. Clara turned her head to look at him. You were protecting me. I was protecting myself, Leo corrected, with the particular honesty she'd come to expect from him in the moments when his composure gave way to something truer, and calling it protection so I didn't have to admit how frightened I was. Men who run organizations like mine learn to dress up fear as strategy. It took you walking through that front door without being asked to make me understand the difference. Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at their joined hands in the evening light. For what it's worth, she said. I read the last chapter of this particular story the moment you smiled at a dying rose like it deserved better. Leo laughed. Real, quiet. The kind that comes from being genuinely surprised by tenderness you weren't braced for. And what did the last chapter say? Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. The rose she'd saved months ago, nodding gently in the evening wind beside them, stubborn and entirely alive. That it was worth every complicated page that came before it, she said. Leo pressed a kiss to the top of her head, simple and certain, the gesture of a man who has finally stopped calculating the cost of caring about something and simply decided to do it anyway. The garden held them there a while longer, unhurried, the kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. Some things only survive because someone stopped long enough to notice they were struggling. Clara Wells spent her whole life believing that was the ordinary work of ordinary people. Nothing heroic, nothing remarkable, just the simple habit of paying attention. What she didn't expect was that paying attention in the right garden, at the right moment, would change everything about whose life she was tending. Leo Ferrante spent 11 years building an empire on the belief that power was the only protection worth having. What he found on a Tuesday afternoon and a woman with dirt on her knees and no fear of speaking the honest truth was that the thing he'd never actually protected was himself. I want to hear something from you, not the polished version, the real one. Has something small and ordinary ever changed your life in a way you didn't see coming? A conversation, a detour, a moment that seemed like nothing until it turned into everything? Tell me in the comments. Those are the stories I think about long after the screen goes dark.